Somewhere in the next decade, a small group of astronauts will likely strap themselves into a spacecraft bound for Mars, fully aware that even if every piece of engineering works exactly as planned, their own bodies may be the one thing standing between them and ever coming home. This isn't a plot device borrowed from science fiction. It's a genuine, actively studied problem in human spaceflight medicine, discussed openly in peer-reviewed journals and NASA mission planning documents, rather than dismissed as speculative worry. And the closer scientists look at it, the more the real obstacle turns out to be biological rather than mechanical. We can probably build the rocket. NASA, SpaceX, and other agencies and companies have already demonstrated most of the individual technologies a Mars mission would require, from heavy lift launch vehicles to life support systems capable of running for years without resupply. What we haven't solved yet is what 3 years away from Earth actually does to a human body, and whether that body, once changed, can ever safely function under Earth's gravity again. Start with the basic shape of the journey, because the numbers alone already set this apart from anything humanity has previously attempted. The Apollo missions reached the moon in about 3 days, 250,000 miles away, well within Earth's own gravitational neighborhood, with a rescue or abort option realistically on the table for much of the trip. Mars is an entirely different proposition. At its closest approach, Mars and Earth are separated by roughly 55 to 60 million kilometers, but a spacecraft can't simply fly in a straight line to get there. Using current chemical propulsion, missions follow a curved transfer orbit that takes advantage of both planets' motion around the Sun, and that path stretches the actual travel distance out dramatically, resulting in a one-way transit time of somewhere between 6 and 9 months, depending on the specific trajectory and how much fuel the mission is willing to spend to shorten it. The return trip isn't simply a mirror image of the outbound one either, and this is where the mission's true length comes from. Earth and Mars only align in a way that makes an efficient return journey possible roughly once every 26 months. A rhythm astronomers call the synodic period, dictated by the different lengths of each planet's orbit around the Sun. That means a crew arriving on Mars can't simply turn around and head home once their scientific work is finished. They have to wait on the Martian surface for the planets to swing back into a favorable position, a wait that typically stretches to somewhere around 500 days. Add that surface, stay to the outbound and return transit times, and a full round-trip mission, door to door, works out to somewhere between 2 and 3 years total, the overwhelming majority of it spent either in transit through deep space or living under a third of Earth's gravity on a planet with no breathable atmosphere. During all of that time, real-time conversation with Earth simply isn't possible, because Mars and Earth are constantly moving along different orbits at different speeds. The distance between them changes continuously, and so does the radio delay. At its closest, a signal takes only around 3 minutes to cross the gap. At its farthest, when Mars sits on the opposite side of the Sun from Earth, that delay stretches to over 20 minutes each way, meaning a simple back and forth exchange, a question and its answer, can take more than 40 minutes to complete. There is no version of mission control talking an astronaut through a crisis in real time. Every conversation becomes a delayed transmission, sent and then waited on, with no ability to interrupt, clarify, or respond quickly if something goes wrong. And if something does go wrong, the honest, sobering reality is that there is no rescue mission on standby. The nearest fully equipped hospital, for all practical purposes, is months away in either direction. But the real story here isn't the distance or the isolation, as dramatic as both genuinely are. It's what happens inside the human body itself over the course of a journey like this, because a Mars mission forces the human body through 3 fundamentally different gravitational environments in sequence, each one demanding an entirely different kind of physical adaptation, with no real recovery period built in between any of them. First comes 6 to 9 months of true weightlessness during the outbound flight. Then comes an extended stay on the Martian surface, where gravity is only about 38% of Earth's, enough to feel like something, but nowhere near enough to fully exercise a body evolved for Earth's full gravitational load. And then, if a return is even attempted, so there's another 6 to 9 months of weightlessness on the flight home, followed by the sudden, jarring reintroduction to full Earth gravity after years spent almost entirely without it. Scientists studying long-duration spaceflight already have a reasonably clear picture of what each of these transitions does to the body individually, largely thanks to decades of research aboard the International Space Station. What remains far less certain is what happens when a single human body is forced through all 3, back to back, over a period of years, rather than the roughly 6-month missions most of that existing research is actually based on. The most immediately dangerous of these threats is one astronauts can't see, feel, or defend against, in any practical way, cosmic radiation. Here on Earth, we're shielded from the overwhelming majority of it by 2 overlapping layers of protection: our planet's magnetic field, which deflects charged particles away from the surface, and our atmosphere, which absorbs much of what gets through. Astronauts traveling to Mars lose both of those protections almost entirely. NASA got its first real direct measurement of this danger not from a human volunteer, but from an instrument riding along inside the Curiosity rover's own spacecraft during its actual 2011 to 2012 journey to Mars, a detector called the Radiation Assessment Detector, or RAD, positioned inside the vehicle roughly the way a human crew compartment would be. The data it returned was sobering. During the roughly 8-month cruise alone, RAD measured a radiation dose rate equivalent to about 1.8 millisieverts per Dalton Y, which adds up to somewhere around 660 millisieverts just for one leg of the trip. Once the rover reached the Martian surface, the dose rate dropped, since Mars's thin atmosphere provides at least some shielding, though nowhere near what Earth's does, averaging roughly 2/3 of a millisievert per day at the surface. Taken together, a full mission profile involving a 180-day outbound flight, an extended stay of around 500 days on Mars, and a 180-day return flight adds up to a cumulative dose of approximately 101 sieverts, according to the RAD team's own published analysis in the journal Science. To put that number in perspective, NASA currently limits its astronauts to a career radiation dose that translates to roughly 600 millisieverts of effective exposure, a threshold designed to keep an individual astronaut's lifetime added risk of fatal cancer below about 3%. A single Mars mission, based on Curiosity's actual measured data, would push an astronaut to nearly double that entire career limit in one trip alone. For comparison, an astronaut spending 6 months aboard the International Space Station, protected by Earth's magnetic field even at orbital altitude, typically absorbs somewhere in the range of 50 to 100 millisieverts total, meaning a Mars mission could expose a crew member to somewhere around 10 times more radiation than an equivalent length stay in low Earth orbit. And this particular danger doesn't respond well to the obvious fix. The most damaging component of deep space radiation, galactic cosmic rays, consists of extremely high energy particles that pass straight through modest shielding, largely unaffected, and thick, heavy shielding can actually make the problem worse in certain configurations, because those particles can collide with shielding material and produce a cascade of secondary radiation, sometimes referred to as a spallation effect, that can be nearly as dangerous as the radiation it was meant to block. The long-term health consequences researchers associate with this level of exposure are genuinely severe, meaningfully elevated lifetime cancer risk, accelerated cardiovascular aging and damage to blood vessels, documented cognitive effects including impaired memory and slower decision-making in animal studies exposed to simulated galactic cosmic ray radiation, and an increased likelihood of early cataracts, a pattern already observed to a lesser degree in astronauts who have flown multiple long-duration missions in low Earth orbit. While radiation works its damage largely invisibly, something equally dramatic and considerably better documented is happening simultaneously to an astronaut's skeleton and muscles, and this is where the science moves from theoretical risk to consistently observed, measured fact. The human body is, in a very real sense, a machine calibrated for constant resistance against Earth's gravity. Every step, every time you stand up from a chair, every ordinary movement throughout an entire day quietly signals to your bones and muscles that they're needed, and that signal is what keeps them strong. Remove that constant load, and the body responds by treating bone and muscle as expendable. Decades of research aboard Mir and the International Space Station have established this pattern with real precision. Even with a rigorous countermeasure program, roughly 2.5 hours of resistance and cardiovascular exercise, 6 days a week, astronauts still lose bone mineral density at a rate of approximately 1 to 2% per month in weight-bearing regions like the hip, spine, and pelvis, the exact structures a person depends on to stand, walk, and absorb impact on Earth. Without that daily exercise regimen, historical data from earlier space stations recorded losses climbing even higher, in some cases over 2% per month at certain skeletal sites. Extrapolate a rate like that across the roughly 30 months of combined weightlessness and reduced Martian gravity involved in a full Mars mission, and researchers have calculated the resulting bone loss could plausibly fall somewhere in the range of 30 to 60% of original bone density if countermeasures prove only partially effective at that duration, an outcome NASA's own musculoskeletal researchers describe as a genuinely serious, open problem for mission planning, not a solved one. To make that number tangible, consider that a postmenopausal woman experiencing significant clinically diagnosed osteoporosis on Earth typically loses somewhere around 30 to 40% of her peak bone mass, usually over the course of a decade or more of gradual decline. An astronaut returning from a full-length Mars mission could plausibly be looking at bone loss in that same range, or worse, compressed into roughly 2.5 years instead of 10. And recovery, once back on Earth, is neither quick nor guaranteed to be complete. A 2022 study published in Scientific Reports followed astronauts for a full year after returning from long-duration spaceflight, and found that for those who had flown missions longer than 6 months, key measures of bone strength and density at the tibia remained meaningfully below their pre-flight baseline even after 12 full months back on Earth, with researchers noting that longer missions were consistently associated with poor lower recovery. Muscle tissue follows a strikingly similar pattern, and for many of the same underlying reasons. Without gravity to work against, muscles that once handled the constant ordinary labor of standing, walking, and simply holding the body upright begin losing mass and strength within just a few weeks, with documented losses of 10 to 20% of muscle mass on missions of only a few months, even with regular in-flight exercise. The muscles most affected tend to be exactly the ones that matter most for walking and standing upright afterward: the legs, the lower back, and the core. At the cellular level, something specific and somewhat counterintuitive happens too. Muscle fiber composition shifts away from the slow, fatigue-resistant type of fiber the body normally relies on for sustained, everyday activity, toward faster fiber types built for short bursts of effort, but poorly suited to the kind of continuous exertion that ordinary life on Earth actually requires. Astronauts returning from 6-month missions aboard the ISS frequently describe genuinely basic tasks: climbing a single flight of stairs, standing for an extended period, as unexpectedly exhausting in the weeks immediately following their return, despite having exercised diligently throughout their mission. Joints and connective tissue aren't spared either. Without regular mechanical loading, cartilage, which normally functions as a shock-absorbing cushion between bones, gradually thins, a change associated with elevated long-term risk of joint problems and early arthritis, occasionally even in astronauts who are otherwise still relatively young. The cardiovascular system undergoes its own quiet, significant transformation, one that arguably matters more for a return to Earth than any other single change. On Earth, your heart is constantly working against gravity to push blood upward toward your head and upper body, a task that simply doesn't exist the same way in weightlessness, where fluid distributes itself far more evenly throughout the body. Researchers led by cardiologist Benjamin Levine have documented that astronaut hearts on long-duration missions don't just weaken, they actually change shape, becoming measurably more spherical rather than retaining their normal, more elongated form, a structural adaptation to no longer needing to generate strong directional pressure against gravity. At the same time, roughly a liter or more of blood plasma that would normally pool in the legs on Earth instead shifts upward toward the head and chest, producing the puffy face and noticeably thinner legs astronauts often develop in orbit, an effect crews have informally nicknamed bird legs. The body, sensing what it interprets as an excess of fluid in the upper body, responds by reducing its total blood volume, sometimes by 10 to 20%, a genuinely significant adjustment. The real consequence of all this shows up only once gravity returns. Astronauts stepping off a 6-month ISS mission frequently experience what's clinically called orthostatic intolerance, a sudden inability to maintain healthy blood pressure while simply standing upright, causing dizziness, a racing heart, and in some documented cases, actual fainting, all because a heart and circulatory system that spent months adapted to weightlessness suddenly has to fight gravity again with a reduced blood volume and an altered, less efficient shape. After a mission stretching 2 to 3 years rather than 6 months, with an added stop at only 38% gravity in between two full weightless phases, the honest scientific answer is that nobody knows with certainty how severe this effect would become, because no human being has ever actually experienced that specific sequence. What existing research does strongly suggest is that the underlying mechanism would only be amplified by a longer, more complex mission profile, not lessened by it. There's a related complication tied directly to that bone loss worth understanding on its own, because it introduces an entirely different kind of medical emergency into a mission where evacuation genuinely isn't an option. As bone breaks down faster than the body can rebuild it in microgravity, the calcium released from that degraded bone doesn't simply vanish. It enters the bloodstream and eventually has to be filtered out through the kidneys, dramatically raising the concentration of calcium in an astronaut's urine throughout a mission. That elevated calcium load significantly increases the risk of kidney stones, a condition that's uncomfortable and inconvenient on Earth, where it's treated with pain medication, fluids, and if necessary, same-day access to a hospital, but which becomes a genuinely serious medical crisis on a spacecraft or a Martian outpost months away from the nearest surgical facility. NASA has already documented kidney stone risk as a real elevated concern among astronauts, even on standard 6-month ISS rotations, and mission planners studying Mars specifically flag it as one of the more mundane sounding, but genuinely mission-threatening medical risks the crew would face. Precisely because there's no way to simply fly a patient home for treatment partway through a multi-year mission, vision presents its own distinct, well-documented problem, one NASA didn't fully appreciate until multiple long-duration astronauts began reporting it independently. The same upward fluid shift responsible for puffy faces in orbit also increases pressure inside the skull, and that added pressure can physically flatten the back of the eyeball and cause swelling of the optic nerve, a condition NASA now formally refers to as spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome. Studies examining astronauts after long-duration ISS missions have found measurable structural changes to the eye in a substantial share of long-duration crew members, changes that in some cases have persisted for years after return to Earth, and in a smaller number of cases appear to be entirely permanent. It remains one of the least well understood risks in the entire field, and one that a multi-year Mars mission would expose astronauts to for far longer than any current ISS assignment. One of the clearest, most carefully controlled windows into all of this comes from a genuinely unique piece of research, NASA's Twins study published in 2019. Astronaut Scott Kelly spent nearly a full year aboard the International Space Station, while his identical twin brother, retired astronaut Mark Kelly, remained on Earth the entire time, giving researchers an almost perfect natural experiment, two genetically identical bodies, one exposed to long-duration spaceflight and one not. The results were extensive and, in places, genuinely surprising. Scott's telomeres, the protective caps at the ends of chromosomes that typically shorten with age and stress, actually lengthened during his time in orbit, an unexpected finding researchers are still working to fully explain, only to rapidly shorten again within just days of his return to Earth, snapping back toward, and in some measures past, his pre-flight baseline. Researchers also documented measurable changes in gene expression tied to immune function, DNA repair, and bone formation, along with a temporary but real decline in cognitive speed and accuracy on certain tests performed shortly after his return, changes that mostly, though not entirely, resolved within the following months. The twins' study only covered a single year in low Earth orbit, still shielded to some degree by Earth's magnetic field, and researchers involved in the study were careful to note that its findings can't simply be scaled up to predict what a multi-year Mars mission would do. But it remains the single best controlled dataset humanity has for understanding how spaceflight reshapes a human body at the genetic and cellular level, and virtually every effect it documented pointed in the same direction, toward change that was significant, only partially reversible, and directly tied to how long the exposure lasted. There's a psychological dimension to all of this too, one that receives less attention than bone density statistics, but that NASA takes seriously enough to fund dedicated research programs around it. Confined for years inside a small spacecraft and later a Martian habitat, with communication delays, making real-time contact with friends and family on Earth genuinely impossible, and with rescue simply off the table if something goes wrong, a Mars crew would face a form of extended isolation with essentially no precedent in human spaceflight history. NASA has studied related conditions using ground-based isolation facilities, including a habitat called Hera at Johnson Space Center, where volunteer crews spend weeks or months in sealed Mars mission analog conditions specifically to study how confinement, restricted communication, and simulated mission stress affect sleep, mood, team cohesion, and decision-making. And Arctic research stations offer another useful, if imperfect, comparison, since crews wintering over in isolated stations face months of confinement with limited outside contact, and researchers have documented real patterns there, including a well-known dip in morale once a mission is well past its midpoint but still far from over, sometimes called the third quarter phenomenon. None of these analogs perfectly replicates a Mars mission's specific combination of physical danger, communication delay, and genuine irreversibility, and it remains a genuinely open question how a crew would fare psychologically across a full 2 to 3 year mission with no real possibility of an early return home. Given all of this, it's worth being precise about what scientists are actually claiming, because the honest version of this story is more nuanced and in some ways more unsettling than a flat, unconditional statement that nobody could ever physically return from Mars. NASA, ESA, and independent researchers studying this problem are not asserting that returning is a strict biological impossibility in the way that, say, faster than light travel is a strict physical impossibility. What they are saying is that returning safely without catastrophic, likely permanent damage to the crew's cardiovascular system, skeleton, and possibly cognitive function is not something current technology and current medical countermeasures can currently guarantee, particularly for a mission stretching into the 2 to 3 year range this profile demands. A body that has spent years in weightlessness and reduced gravity, its bones porous, its heart reshaped and deconditioned, its blood volume reduced, would face a landing on Earth in a severely weakened state at meaningfully elevated risk of bone fracture from something as simple as standing up too quickly, and at real risk of the heart itself struggling to pump blood against full Earth gravity after years without needing to. Whether that qualifies as never coming home again, or simply as an extraordinarily dangerous homecoming that current medicine can't yet make safe, is genuinely a matter of definition and reasonable scientists studying the problem land on different sides of exactly how to phrase it. None of this means researchers are simply watching these problems unfold without trying to intervene. Alongside daily exercise, scientists have spent years testing pharmaceutical countermeasures originally developed for osteoporosis patients on Earth, including a class of drugs called bisphosphonates, which slow the rate at which the body breaks down bone. Early trials combining these drugs with the standard ISS exercise regimen have shown real promise in reducing bone loss beyond what exercise alone achieves, and similar research is underway into drugs that target muscle wasting directly, including compounds that block a protein called myostatin, which normally limits muscle growth. None of these interventions currently eliminate the underlying problem, and none have been tested across anything close to multi-year timescale a Mars mission would actually involve. But they represent a genuine active area of research rather than a problem researchers have simply resigned themselves to. There is at least one proposed engineering solution that could meaningfully change this entire equation, and it's worth understanding why it hasn't been built yet. Artificial gravity, generated by slowly rotating part or all of a spacecraft to create centrifugal force that mimics the pull of real gravity, has been a serious subject of engineering study since at least the 1960 seconds. And in theory, a rotating Mars transit vehicle could allow a crew to experience something approximating Earth or Martian gravity for most of the outbound and return journey, potentially preventing the majority of the bone, muscle, and cardiovascular deteriorations described here almost entirely. The physics behind the concept is well understood and not seriously in dispute. The obstacle is almost entirely practical. Engineering a spacecraft large enough to rotate at a comfortable, non-nauseating speed while producing a meaningful fraction of Earth's gravity requires either a very large rotating radius or careful trade-offs most current spacecraft designs simply aren't built to accommodate, and no crewed rotating spacecraft of that kind has ever actually been constructed or tested in flight. NASA and other space agencies continue to study the concept seriously, including ongoing research into partial gravity's effects using shorter radius centrifuges. But as of right now, every mission architecture actually being planned for a crewed Mars mission in the coming decade assumes a standard non-rotating spacecraft, meaning the full weightlessness problem described throughout this video remains, for now, the reality any near-term Mars crew would actually face. There's a useful way to hold all of these individual findings together at once, rather than as a scattered list of separate problems. Every system described here, the skeleton, the muscles, the heart, the eyes, the immune response documented in the twin study, responds to the same underlying trigger, the sudden removal of a mechanical and gravitational environment that human physiology spent hundreds of thousands of years quietly calibrating itself around. None of these changes are exotic diseases introduced by space itself. They're simply what an already well-understood biological system does when the one constant force it was built around disappears for years at a time. That's precisely what makes the problem so difficult to simply engineer around with a clever gadget or a single new material. It isn't a single point of failure. It's dozens of interconnected systems, all quietly deteriorating together at different rates for the same underlying reason. All of which leads to the genuinely strange, almost unprecedented position the first Mars astronauts may find themselves in. Every previous form of human exploration in history, however dangerous, has generally assumed a return trip was the eventual goal, even when the odds of survival along the way were grim. A Mars mission, based on everything current medicine understands about the human body's response to years of altered gravity and radiation exposure, might be the first form of exploration in history where the destination itself is functionally safer to remain on than the return trip is to attempt. Whether the first crews to reach Mars actually choose or are advised to stay rather than risk the physiological toll of coming home is a decision that hasn't been made yet and depends heavily on how quickly countermeasures, from better radiation shielding to artificial gravity to improved exercise and pharmaceutical interventions already being tested on the ISS, actually mature in the years before any real mission launches. But the underlying science driving that decision isn't speculative fiction dressed up as documentary. It's the direct, measured, repeatedly replicated result of everything researchers have learned from 6 decades of watching what happens to the human body every single time it leaves the one planet it evolved to survive on. If stories like this pull you in, subscribe to the channel, because this is exactly the kind of territory we spend our time exploring here. Drop a comment and tell me which part surprised you most. The radiation dose alone nearly maxing out an astronaut's entire career limit in one single trip. The idea that a returning astronaut's heart might genuinely struggle to pump blood against Earth's gravity again. Or the strange twist that artificial gravity, a fix scientists have understood in theory for 60 years, still hasn't actually been built. Let me know where in the world you're watching this from, and if you want to keep exploring, there's another documentary waiting for you right here on the channel. So stay a little longer and let's keep looking up.